So today we're going to talk about a discovery that just shatters one of the most fundamental ideas about who we are. This is a story that pushes the dawn of technology way, way back and forces us to ask a pretty wild question. What if the first inventor on Earth wasn't human?
It seems like a simple question, right? I mean, when you picture the first person or the first thing to pick up a rock and turn it into a tool, what do you see?
Well, for decades, science had a really simple answer. Toolmaking? That was our thing. You know, it was seen as the defining trait that separated our direct ancestors, the genus Homo, from literally everything else on Earth. It was the spark, the thing that made us, well, us.
But then, a discovery back in 2011, out in Kenya, just completely flipped that whole idea on its head. It proved that the story of technology, our story, didn't actually start with us. In fact, get this. It started an almost unimaginable 700,000 years before our genus even showed up.
Okay, so this discovery basically blows up what's called the human as toolmaker myth. This idea we've had for so long that only our ancestors could invent tools. And to really get why this is such a game changer, let's take a quick look at what used to be the oldest technology we knew about.
So for ages, the undisputed champions of ancient tech were the Oldowan tools. And yeah, they were pretty simple, basically just stone choppers and flakes, but for their time, they were an absolutely massive leap forward.
They clocked in at about 2.6 million years old. And for so long, that was it. That was the starting line. Year zero for technology. It was the baseline, and everyone pretty much agreed it was linked to the first members of our genus, like Homo habilis, handyman.
But then 2011 rolls around, and everything changes. A team of archaeologists working near Lake Turkana in Kenya, they just stumbled onto something that would send absolute shockwaves through the entire field of paleoanthropology.
Okay, so here's what happened. At this site, Lomekwi 3, a team led by Sonia Harmon found something that, by all counts, just shouldn't have been there. They're looking at this dry riverbed, and they see stone tools, but they looked off. They were bigger, way cruder, and just more primitive than any Oldowan tool ever found. We're talking heavy anvils, big chunky cores, and the simple sharp flakes that were smashed off of them. Now, the team knew they had something seriously old on their hands. But when the dating results came back, whoa, they were just staggering. They used a really cool method called paleomagnetism, which basically looks at how the Earth's magnetic field gets locked into rock layers over time to figure out just how old this site was.
3.3 million years old. Just let that number sink in for a second. This wasn't just pushing the timeline back a little bit. This was like tearing out the first chapter of the human story and starting from scratch.
And looking at this timeline really puts it all into perspective, right? You see the Oldowan tools way over there at 2.6 million years ago. But Lomekwi, it shoves that starting line back by an incredible 700,000 years. I mean, think about that. That gap is longer than our entire species Homo sapiens has even existed. So, naturally, this raised a huge question.
If our own genus, Homo, wasn't even around 3.3 million years ago, then who in the world were these first engineers?
And that's the great mystery of Lomekwi, isn't it? You've got the tools, the date is solid as a rock, but the culprit, the toolmaker, is missing from the scene. So who could it have been?
Well, scientists have a couple of prime suspects. First up is Australopithecus afarensis. You probably know that one, it's Lucy's species. The other big contender is a less famous species from the same time, Kenyanthropus platyops, and they found fossils of this one super close to the Lomekwi site.
Okay, quick clarification on a term here, just so we're all on the same page. The word is hominin, and that's just the big family tree of all the upright walking apes. It includes us, modern humans, but also all our extinct relatives like Australopithecus. So yeah, the Lomekwi toolmakers were definitely hominins, but they weren't human in the way we normally use that word.
And that, right there, is the revolutionary part of this whole thing. The ability to think up and create technology wasn't something that started with our genus Homo. Nope. It was an invention of our much older, smaller-brained ancestors. And that means the very thing we thought made us so special, our technology, actually has these really deep, non-human roots. It changes everything.
So, what does this actually tell us about the minds of these ancient engineers? Because, let's be clear, making these tools wasn't just a simple case of banging rocks together.
Think about the mental checklist you'd need. First, you have to pick out a big, heavy stone to use as an anvil. Then you've got to find just the right kind of rock for a core, one that you know will break in a useful way. Then comes the really hard part. You have to hit that core against the anvil with just the right amount of force and at the perfect angle to knock off a sharp flake. And finally, you have to realize that this little sharp flake is the answer to a problem, like getting into a tough nut or slicing up some food.
That whole process shows a huge cognitive leap, you know? It proves these hominins had foresight. They were planning for the future. It shows they had the dexterity, the hand-eye coordination to actually pull it off, and maybe most importantly, it shows they could solve problems in an abstract way. They weren't just living in their environment, they were starting to shape it.
And what's really cool is when you put the Lomacry tools side by side with the old Yuan tools from 700,000 years later, you can literally see the beginning of technological evolution. The later tools get smaller, they're more refined, they're made for more delicate work. This is the first time we can actually see technological progress in the archaeological record. It's amazing. All right, so let's zoom out for a second and think about the big picture here. What does it really mean that technology itself is fundamentally older than humans?
Well, creating tools was a massive turning point. In terms of diet, it suddenly unlocked all these high-energy foods they couldn't get before, things like bone marrow, tough plants, or nuts with hard shells. For the environment, this is the very first time we see our ancestors actively start to engineer their world to fit their needs. And this is crucial. For culture, it's the earliest sign of knowledge being passed down from one to another, probably by watching and copying. That is culture, happening 3.3 million years ago.
So really, what it all boils down to is this. The Lomacry tools show us that the drive to invent, to solve problems with technology, and to share that knowledge, that's not just a human thing. It's a deeply rooted hominin thing. The foundations for everything we've ever built as a species, they were laid down long before we showed up, by ancestors we're really just starting to get to know.
And that kind of leaves us with one last, really fascinating thought to chew on. For thousands of years, we've basically defined ourselves as the toolmaker. That's who we are. But if the very first technological revolution on this entire planet wasn't even a human invention, then what does that say about the nature of intelligence itself? And maybe, just maybe, where it might pop up next?